that meantime, we've got Misty Marris with us, trial attorney. Misty, first of all, your reaction to this acquittal.
Well, wow. After all of the deadlocking that occurred last week, the manslaughter charge being dismissed, and now the jury reconvenes with this lesser charge, and it becomes very clear that if there were holdouts that wanted to convict Daniel Penny, they, over the weekend and going back into that deliberation room this morning, changed their mind and ultimately made this determination of not guilty. And Marni, I have to think, because, you know, the jurors were deliberating, 30 plus hours, and then they were in a deadlock, and then, you know, they leave the room, come back, and the judge says, the manslaughter charge is dismissed. Now you can come back on Monday and talk about criminally negligent homicide. And, you know, they're not privy to what the court arguments were between the defense and the prosecution or the why. But I have to imagine, do you think some of those jurors went home this weekend and thought to themselves, well, how much does the prosecution believe in this case, or had a thought that the manslaughter charge just disappearing was odd, and maybe that was part of the decision relatively quickly here on this Monday morning. They just began deliberating at around 9:45.
Yeah. Well, and then the other thing, Misty, I wonder is on Friday, we had the civil case filed by Jordan Neely's dad against Daniel Penny, now with a not guilty verdict. What happens to that case?
So the civil case will proceed in a civil court. There's a different evidentiary standard. If Daniel Penny had been found guilty, then in the civil case, there would have been a determination on liability, meaning he would have, Jordan Neely's family would have won. And then it would just be about damages. But since Daniel Penny was acquitted and found not guilty, the case will proceed, and the plaintiff, the family of Jordan Neely, will have to argue about liability too. And the arguments will be very similar, whether or not there was justification in holding Neely down for that amount of time, whether there was self-defense. But Marni, it's a different evidentiary standard. It's much lower. It's called preponderance of the evidence, meaning 51% as opposed to beyond a reasonable doubt. So it basically has to be litigated from anew in that civil court. So this particular proceeding, other than really knowing what the evidence will show, because we've seen a lot of it play out in the courtroom, it's going to be a whole new proceeding on the civil side.
Wow. What else stands out to you? Legal options for the prosecution in this case, or just next steps?
Well, you know, prosecution, now that there's an acquittal, it's done as far as this case is concerned. It cannot be resurrected. Double jeopardy does attach. The manslaughter charge was dismissed with prejudice. That was last week, meaning it could never have been revived, even if the jury was hung. And now that there's an acquittal, Daniel Penny has been found not guilty by a jury of his peers. So the prosecutors cannot resurrect or revive this case in any way. So at this point, this case is over.
And legally speaking, you know, a case of force, holding someone down in a situation like this, if you have a background and training to do so, what message does something like this send to the broader public when they find themselves in similar dangerous situations?
Well, I think, Marni, there might be a chilling effect just by virtue of the trial. Now, look, Daniel Penny's been exonerated. He's been found not guilty. But I do think a good Samaritan is going to think twice before stepping in and intervening. And I say that because this prosecution of Daniel Penny moved forward right to the very end. There was never talk of a plea deal or anything like that. And he was charged, even though that manslaughter charge got dismissed last week, he was charged with manslaughter. And so, you know, and criminally negligent homicide, both felonies. So certainly that could have an effect on individuals who may want to step in. But on the flip side, it's also a cautionary tale about maybe when it goes too far, and understanding that even good intentioned individuals, there's the possibility that from a legal perspective, it's too far. That is not this case. Now we have clarity. And Marni, I'm hoping some of these jurors, they don't have to, and they can choose not to, but I'm hoping that we hear from them, because I'd love to know what the change of heart was in this courtroom on Monday morning after so many hours of deliberation.
Yeah, I know they struggled with it. It was clear by the time that it was taking. Misty, stand by. I want to go back to Misty Marris here for one moment. Misty, if you are advising Daniel Penny, he certainly wants to put this all behind him and move on with his life. Do you expect that we will hear from him after the culmination of this trial?
Yeah, Marni, well, we could hear, a very curated statement about thank you to the jury for doing their job or something to that effect. I doubt he would get into any of the facts or specifics or the merits or anything relating specifically to the case. And I say that because that civil lawsuit is still pending. So there is some awareness from a legal perspective about anything that's said, even in the aftermath of this criminal trial, where he certainly has a victory here and not guilty verdict, but anything could potentially work its way back into that civil courtroom. So if we do hear from him, I would expect it to be very curated, probably worked through with the attorneys, and not much digging into any of the actual facts or merits of the case.
All right. Well, all eyes on the courthouse in New York, waiting for the defense and prosecution to leave after a not guilty verdict for Daniel Penny in the New York Subway Chokehold case.